Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm so glad you're here with us. I really am. Whether you've had a long day, whether your mind feels tired and worn down by everything you've had to carry, whether you're having a quiet evening all to yourself and you want some company, or whether you simply need a moment of comfort and peace to wrap yourself in before sleep comes, tonight's story is here for you. There's something quite special about slipping under your blankets and letting a gentle voice ease you toward rest, isn't there? It makes everything feel a little bit lighter. It makes the world feel a little bit softer. When we listen, when we slow down and open ourselves fully to a story, our bodies naturally begin to relax in a way that's almost effortless. Our shoulders drop, the muscles in our necks and jaws unclench. Our breathing deepens and becomes more rhythmic. The tension we carry with us throughout the day, all of that stress and effort and strain, starts to melt away bit by bit until we're left with just ourselves and the quiet and the comforting sound of a voice speaking gently into the darkness. So go ahead now and find yourself in the most comfortable position you can. Pull your blankets up high if you need to, wrapping yourself in that cozy cocoon. Adjust your pillow until it feels just right beneath your head and neck. Let yourself sink down into the mattress, feeling the support underneath you, feeling the way your body can finally rest. There's nothing you need to do right now. This is a space that's all yours. This is a moment you've carved out just for rest and for listening, and you deserve every second of it. Tonight, we have a very special story for you. It's about an old woman named Margaret and a small bakery nestled quietly on a street corner in a little town that you might recognize if you listened carefully. It's about an ordinary morning that becomes anything but ordinary. It's about the moment when a life that feels complete and settled in its own quiet way gets gently disrupted by something unexpected, something precious, something that changes everything without asking permission first. This is a story about kindness, about the way compassion can awaken in our hearts when we least expect it, and about how love sometimes arrives in the most surprising ways at the most unexpected moments. So settle in now. Take a deep breath in through your nose, and as you exhale, let yourself drift into this world with me. Let the pace of this story become your pace. Let the warmth of this little bakery wrap around you like a soft blanket that someone has woven just for you. And as the story unfolds, as you listen and begin to relax more and more, know that you're safe here, you're welcome here, and there's nowhere else you need to be but exactly where you are right now, listening, resting, and letting yourself sink deeper and deeper into comfort. Margaret had been running her bakery for more than 40 years. She was 72 now, though she rarely thought of herself in terms of numbers or years. What she knew instead was the weight of the baking trays in her hands, the particular grey of the sky on autumn mornings, the exact moment when butter and sugar came together into something golden and perfect and impossible to replicate twice. She knew her neighbourhood the way some people know their own hands. Every crack in the pavement, every tree that needed trimming, every house where a light always came on at the same time each evening, like clockwork. She could tell you which neighbours took their coffee hot and which preferred it cooled just slightly. She could tell you which customers wanted their bread sliced thick and which preferred it thin. She had chosen a quiet life, a solitary life in many ways, and it suited her perfectly. It fit her like her favourite cardigan, soft and familiar, and exactly the right shape, worn in all the places where she needed it to be worn. Most mornings, Margaret woke before the dawn. She didn't use an alarm clock anymore. There had been a time, in her younger days, when she needed one, but she had learned to trust her body's internal rhythm. It had been calibrated by decades of early mornings, and the deep, bone-level knowledge that her customers depended on her. That responsibility had sunk into her the way water sinks into soil. At 5 o'clock, or sometimes a few minutes before, her eyes would simply open. There would be no sudden jolt, no harsh awakening. It was gentle, natural, as though her body was simply remembering something it had always known. The darkness would still linger outside her bedroom window. The house would be silent, holding its breath in the darkness, and Margaret would lie there for just a moment, taking in the feeling of her warm bed, the down pillow beneath her head that had moulded itself perfectly to her shape over countless nights, the weight of her quilted blanket across her body, the one with the pattern of blue flowers that had been faded for years. These were small things, yes, but she had learned, over the years, to notice and cherish the small things. They were often the most meaningful. She would push back the blankets slowly, letting the cool air touch her skin, and sit up. Her knees would creak just a little. They always did. A small protest against the years and the weight of her own body. And she would take a moment to stretch her arms above her head before standing. She would flex her fingers, roll her shoulders back, preparing her body for the day ahead. Her slippers waited for her on the floor beside the bed, soft and worn from years of use. They were a faded maroon colour, like old wine, like something precious that had aged into a deeper shade of itself. They moulded perfectly to the shape of her feet, fitting her in a way that felt almost like an embrace. She had stopped wondering how long they had lasted. She simply accepted that they would be there when she needed them. Faithful companions in her daily routine. She shuffled into them and made her way down the hallway to the kitchen, moving slowly and deliberately, giving her body time to wake and adjust to the day that was just beginning. The first thing Margaret did, always, was fill the kettle. She would grip its handle with one hand. Her hands were a map of age now, with age spots and veins that stood out beneath her skin, and use the other to turn on the tap, running cold water until it was full. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. She would set it on the stove and turn the flame to medium-high, listening for the soft whoosh as the gas ignited. Then, while she waited for the water to boil, she would move about her kitchen with purpose and grace. She would get out her teapot, a ceramic one with a faded blue glaze that had been chipped in several places but still poured perfectly, and place it on the counter beside the stove. She would select her tea from the tin where she kept her collection of loose leaves. This morning she chose her favourite, a strong black tea with hints of bergamot, the one that tasted like something almost floral but not quite. She had been drinking it for years, long before it became popular again at fancy coffee shops. She had simply known somehow that this was the tea she wanted to drink for the rest of her life. The kettle began to whistle, its thin, insistent voice cutting through the kitchen silence like a call. Margaret poured the hot water over her tea leaves, watching them unfurl and dance in the heat. They swirled around like tiny swimmers, releasing their colour into the water. She breathed in the steam rising from the pot, letting it warm her face, letting it open up her sinuses. It smelled like comfort. It smelled like home. It smelled like beginning. She prepared her cup with a small splash of milk, just as she always did, watching the cream spiral through the darker tea before mixing completely. She carried it to her favourite window seat, cradling the warm cup in her hands. This was the room where she ate most of her meals, where she read her books, where she watched the neighbourhood slowly come to life on mornings like this one. Outside, the street was still mostly dark, that deep dark that comes just before dawn. A few houses had porch lights burning, small islands of yellow in the vast darkness. The street lamps cast their pale, almost sickly yellow glow on the empty sidewalks. No one else was awake yet. No one else was moving. The whole world seemed asleep. Margaret had this time to herself. The quiet, the stillness, the profound sense that the whole world was still dreaming and she alone was awake to witness it, to be present in this liminal space between night and day. She sipped her tea slowly, letting each swallow warm her from the inside out. The heat travelled down her throat and into her chest, and she could feel it spreading through her body like sunrise spreading across the sky, like light moving across water. She gazed out at the familiar view. The maple tree across the street with its branches just beginning to turn golden brown and red and orange. The white fence of her neighbour's yard that needed painting again, but somehow looked better faded. The lamppost where birds gathered in the afternoons to argue and sing. Everything was as it should be. Everything was exactly as she had come to expect it to be after all these years. There was a comfort in this predictability, a safety in knowing what to expect, in being able to rely on the patterns and rhythms of life. Some people might have found it lonely, might have felt trapped by the repetition, suffocated by the sameness. But Margaret had made peace with solitude long ago. She had learned to treasure it. She had learned that a quiet life was not the same thing as an empty one. A quiet life could be full of meaning, full of purpose, full of small satisfactions that most people never noticed. After her tea, Margaret would shower. The water ran warm, almost hot, and she let it cascade over her skin, washing away the last remnants of sleep. She would wash her face with warm water and a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender, a smell she had come to associate with cleanliness and fresh beginnings. She would run a comb through her grey hair, short now, practical, easier to manage than it had been when she was younger, and dress herself in the kinds of clothes she always wore. She had long ago stopped worrying about fashion or what was in style. She wore clothes that were comfortable, that fit well, that had been washed so many times they felt soft against her skin. Today, she chose a soft green shirt, the colour of early spring leaves, and her favourite cardigan, the one with the slightly frayed edges that she couldn't bring herself to throw away because it had belonged to someone she loved long ago. She slipped on her brown slacks, the ones that had softened with age and countless washings until they felt almost like silk. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw an old woman looking back. Her face had lines around her eyes and mouth. Her neck showed her age, but her eyes were still clear, still kind. She was not vain about any of it. It was simply a fact of her life. She had lived 72 years and she had earned every line and every grey hair. In her bedroom, Margaret gathered the things she would need for the day. She put her wallet in her cardigan pocket, though she rarely spent money on anything other than the supplies her bakery required. She found her keys on the small table by the door, hanging from a hook shaped like a key itself. A whimsical gift from a customer years ago, someone who had thought it was funny. She picked up her purse, which she carried with her everywhere out of habit more than anything else, though she rarely needed anything from it. It was simply something she had always done, and she saw no reason to change. She put on her coat, a practical grey wool coat that had lasted her at least 15 years, and would probably last her for 15 more. It was the kind of coat that actually got softer the older it got, and finally, she tied a soft scarf around her neck, not because the weather was particularly cold, but because it made her feel more prepared, more complete, more ready for whatever the day might bring. It was a comfort thing, really. Margaret left her house at 5:45 every morning without fail. There was something reassuring about that consistency, that unwavering routine. The bakery was only a short walk from her home, down a gentle slope and around the corner. But she liked to give herself plenty of time. She was never rushed. Her life had taught her that rushing was a form of worry, and she had learned to live more gently than that. She moved at her own pace, and that pace was slow and steady, deliberate and peaceful. The morning air was cool on her face as she stepped outside, bracing and alive. Above, the sky was still mostly dark, that deep indigo blue that comes just before dawn, though the faintest hint of grey was appearing on the horizon, the very beginning of light. It was like watching the world slowly wake up, like watching an eye open. Margaret breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the cool air. The air smelled like autumn, like the damp earth warming slightly as the sun approached, like leaves that were beginning to decay and return to the soil, like the slow cooling of the world as it turned away from summer. There was something bittersweet about that smell, something that made her think of endings and beginnings all at once. She could smell rain somewhere in the distance, carried on a wind she couldn't quite feel yet, though the street around her was dry and quiet. As she walked, Margaret thought about what she would bake today. There was a rhythm to her days, a rotation of favourites that her regular customers had come to depend on, that they relied on the way people rely on the sun to rise or the seasons to change. Mondays meant cinnamon rolls with their sweet, sticky centres and their hint of vanilla and spice, rolled up like little scrolls of comfort. Tuesdays meant fruit tarts, whatever fruit was in season, arranged in beautiful spirals that looked almost like art. Wednesdays meant croissants, all buttery layers and golden brown perfection, the kind that shattered between your teeth. Thursdays meant bread, sourdough and whole wheat, baguettes and rolls, the kinds of breads that sustained people. But she also liked to surprise people, to add something new to her cases when the mood struck her, something unexpected that would delight them and remind them that there was still magic in the world. Perhaps today she would make apple turnovers, the kind with fresh grated apples and a sprinkle of cinnamon sugar on top, the filling just tart enough to balance the sweetness. Or maybe biscotti, that twice-baked Italian cookie that people loved to dunk in their coffee, watching it slowly soften as it absorbed the warmth. She turned these possibilities over in her mind as she walked, letting them unfold like flowers opening in the sun, her feet making soft sounds on the pavement, her breath coming out in small clouds in the cool air. Her mind was calm, her body was warm, and she felt that sense of purpose and contentment that came from knowing exactly what you were meant to be doing. The bakery came into view as she turned the corner. It was a small building with a peaked roof, painted a pale cream colour that had weathered to a soft, warm beige over the years. The front door was painted a deep forest green, and beside it was a window where Margaret displayed some of her best goods. Above the door, in simple black letters that had faded to a soft grey, a sign read, "Margaret's Bakery." Sure, she had painted that sign herself when she first opened the shop 40 years ago, full of hope and determination, and barely enough money in the bank to cover the first month's rent. It had faded considerably since then, the letters becoming less distinct with each passing season, but she had never been tempted to repaint it. The fading felt like a record of time, like something earned through years of service and care. The building had a quiet dignity about it, the kind that only comes with age and consistency. Margaret reached into her pocket and withdrew her keys. They were cold in her hand. Old keys, worn smooth from years of use. The morning was still very quiet. A few early birds sang in the trees, their calls tentative, testing the air. A cat slunk across a nearby fence, a dark shadow moving through the pre-dawn darkness. But the street was empty of people. This was the part of the morning that Margaret loved most. That transition between night and day, when the world still felt soft and malleable, full of possibility. It was a liminal space, a moment between moments, and she treasured it. She was about to insert her key into the lock when she heard a sound. It was small, high-pitched, and utterly unexpected. It cut through the quiet morning like a bell ringing. Margaret's hand froze. Her key hovered in the air. The sound came again, a tiny cry, almost like a mewing sound, but not quite. It had a human quality to it, she realised, something that made the back of her neck prickle with alertness. Margaret froze completely. She turned slowly, her key still in her hand, and looked down at the step in front of her bakery door. There, bundled carefully in a soft blue blanket, was a baby. A real baby. A tiny human being. Margaret stared at it, her mind unable to make sense of what she was seeing. It was as though someone had placed an impossible thing on her doorstep, as though the laws of the world had shifted slightly and rearranged themselves while she wasn't looking. For a moment, Margaret couldn't move. She couldn't think. She simply stared, her mind refusing to make sense of what she was seeing. A baby. A real baby, lying on the cold stone step of her bakery like an offering left by some deity or some person in desperate circumstances. The baby was small, probably only a few months old at most, maybe even younger. It was stirring slightly, its tiny fists moving against the blue blanket, its face scrunching up as though it was about to cry again. Margaret could see a wisp of dark hair on top of the baby's head. Margaret's heart began to race. She could feel it pounding against her ribs, could feel her blood moving faster through her veins. Her mind spun with 1,000 questions, each one more pressing than the last. Where had this baby come from? Who had left it here? Was it safe? Was it cold? How long had it been lying on this cold stone step in the pre-dawn darkness? Was it breathing properly? Was it sick? The questions tumbled over each other like water rushing downhill, and she couldn't grab hold of any one of them long enough to think it through. Without thinking, without considering what she was doing or whether it was the right thing, Margaret knelt down beside the baby. She was getting too old for kneeling, and her knees protested, creaking audibly, but she didn't care. The baby was more important than her knees. She reached out slowly, her weathered hand moving toward the blue blanket with caution, as though she might frighten the baby away. The baby was real, solid, warm, alive, and it was looking up at her with wide, unfocused eyes, dark eyes that seemed to be trying to understand what was happening just as much as she was. The baby made that sound again, a small cry, a demand for something. Though what? Margaret couldn't imagine. Hunger, probably, that primal need that all babies had, or a need for warmth, or for comfort, or perhaps all three. The baby had been abandoned, left on a cold stone step in the early morning darkness by someone who must have been desperate or terrified or both. And the baby needed help. It needed care. It needed someone to keep it safe. Margaret straightened up carefully, using the bakery doorframe to pull herself to her feet. Her knees creaked in protest, but she pushed through the discomfort. Then, slowly and deliberately, moving as gently as she had ever moved in her life, she reached down and picked up the baby. The bundle was surprisingly light, surprisingly small, fragile in a way that made her heart constrict. It fit easily into her arms, resting against her body as though it belonged there, as though they had always been meant to fit together like this. As she cradled it against her chest, the baby quieted slightly, its movements stilling. It was as though the movement, the warmth, the simple act of being held by another human being was enough to soothe some of its distress, to make the world feel slightly less overwhelming. Margaret stood there for a moment, the baby in her arms, her key still hanging from her hand. She looked up and down the empty street, the street she had walked down every morning for 40 years. There was no one in sight. No one leaving a note explaining anything. No one who could explain this impossible situation. No one who could tell her what to do or where this child had come from or why they had chosen her bakery, her doorstep, her life. She made a decision then, standing on that empty street in the pre-dawn darkness, holding a baby she had never seen before. It was a decision that would change the shape of the day, and though she didn't know it yet, would change the shape of everything that came after. There would be no going back to the life she had been living just moments before. That quiet, solitary, predictable life had ended, and something new had begun. Margaret turned the key in the lock. It turned smoothly, as it always did, and she heard the familiar click of the mechanism giving way. The door swung open, revealing the dark interior of her bakery. The familiar smell of it hit her immediately. The faint sweetness of yesterday's baking, the richness of coffee grounds that had been sitting in the grinder, the warm earthiness of flour and butter and sugar. It was the smell of home. She stepped inside, still cradling the baby, and pushed the door closed behind her with her hip. The sound it made was solid, reassuring. For a moment she stood in the darkness, just inside the threshold, holding the baby against her chest, feeling its small weight in her arms. It felt right somehow, as though her arms had been waiting all these years for this weight, this warmth, this tiny life. She could feel the baby's breathing against her chest, small and rapid and alive. Then she reached over and flicked the light switch with her free hand. The lights came on gradually, like a slow sunrise, and the bakery came into view around her. Her counters, her ovens, her display cases, the comfortable space she had inhabited for 4 decades and had made into something that felt like an extension of herself. Everything was as she had left it when she'd closed up the night before, and now in her arms there was something new, something unexpected, something that required care and attention and the kind of tenderness and protectiveness she had almost forgotten she possessed. The baby was hers now, or at least she was responsible for the baby now. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Margaret moved deeper into the bakery, moving slowly, carefully, her arms supporting the baby with absolute stability. She walked past her work counter, past her ovens that still held the faint warmth of yesterday's baking, past all the tools and equipment that defined her life. She went toward the back where a small sitting area provided a few comfortable chairs and a sofa covered in a soft green fabric. She settled herself carefully onto the sofa, arranging the cushions behind her back, making sure the baby was secure in her arms. In the early morning light that was just beginning to filter through the windows, that first hint of grey that promised the sunrise was coming, she finally looked directly at the small face that was gazing up at her. The baby was a girl, Margaret thought, though she couldn't be entirely certain. She had a wisp of dark hair on top of her head, soft and fine as down. Her eyes were dark too, almost black, and they were searching Margaret's face with an intensity that only a baby possesses, a focus without judgment, a need without expectation. The baby made a small sound, almost questioning, as if to say, "Who are you? Where am I? What happens now?" It was the most important question any of them could ask. Margaret didn't have answers to those questions. She didn't know where the baby had come from. She didn't know why she had been left here, on this doorstep, at this moment in Margaret's life. She didn't know what was supposed to happen next, or whether she was capable of handling it. But she knew this one thing with absolute certainty. For now, this baby was safe. For now, this baby was warm. For now, this baby was in the care of someone who would do everything in her power to make sure nothing bad happened to her. That was enough for now. That was everything. Margaret settled back into the sofa, the baby cradled against her, and watched as the light in her bakery grew stronger. Outside, the darkness was slowly giving way to that first hint of grey on the horizon. The day was beginning, just as it always did. But everything else was completely different now. Margaret's quiet, solitary, predictable life had transformed in an instant, in the space between one breath and the next, and she had no idea what would come next. The baby settled in Margaret's arms, her tiny body gradually releasing the tension that had held her rigid moments before. There was something almost miraculous about the way a small child could sense safety, could recognize the presence of someone who meant her no harm, who had chosen without hesitation to shelter her. It was as though the baby's entire being was attuned to these vibrations of care, of intention, of love, even though they had been strangers to each other only minutes before. Margaret could feel the baby's small heart beating against her own chest, could feel the rise and fall of her tiny ribs with each breath, and she found herself matching her own breathing to the baby's rhythm, sinking deeper and deeper into the moment, into the presence of this small new person who had upended her entire world. Margaret moved carefully from the sofa to the back room of her bakery, where she kept a small sink and cabinets stocked with supplies. The route was so familiar to her that she could have walked it blindfolded, her feet knowing the way. But now each step felt different, weighted with new awareness, with the knowledge that she was carrying something infinitely precious. She had never thought of this space as being designed for infant care, but then again, she had never thought of many things that were now suddenly true. She looked down at the baby, still wrapped in that soft blue blanket, and realized she had no idea what she was actually supposed to do. And for a moment, a flutter of panic rose in her chest before she pushed it gently aside. She would figure it out. People had been figuring out how to care for babies since the beginning of time. Surely Margaret, with all her years of experience creating nourishment, could manage to care for one small human being. The baby was dressed in pink pajamas with small white ducks printed across them, soft cotton that had been washed many times. The seams were intact, the elastic functional, which suggested that whoever had left this baby here had done so with care, had clothed her properly, had wrapped her in a clean blanket. This was not a baby carelessly discarded, but one that someone had loved. What desperation had driven them to leave her here? Margaret couldn't imagine it. The baby was clean enough, at least as far as Margaret could tell, though she was hardly an expert. What the baby needed most urgently, Margaret suspected, was warmth and perhaps food. She had no formula in the bakery, no bottles, none of the things that babies required. The bakery had been her entire world for 40 years, and in all that time, she had never kept anything there that was designed for anything other than baking or serving customers. She would have to figure things out as she went, one moment at a time, trusting her instincts and her capacity to care, which had been proven adequate in other areas of her life for so many years. Her hands had worked dough and pastry and flour into countless beautiful creations. Surely those same hands could tend to a baby's needs. She filled a small basin with warm water from the sink, testing it carefully with her fingers to ensure it wasn't too hot. Then she found a soft cloth and moistened it. Speaking softly to the baby in a voice she hadn't used in many years, Margaret gently cleaned the baby's face. She washed around the eyes carefully, using a separate corner of the cloth for each eye. She cleaned the baby's tiny nose, her small ears, her delicate chin. The baby's skin was impossibly soft, impossibly delicate, like the petal of a flower or the wing of a butterfly. And her eyes tracked Margaret's movements with that same intense focus, searching, questioning, trying to make sense of this new world, this new person, this new reality. "There you are," Margaret whispered, her voice rough from disuse but warming as she spoke, becoming more natural, more fluid with each word. "There now. You're safe here. You're warm. Everything is going to be all right. I promise you that. My name is Margaret, and I'm going to take care of you now. I'm going to make sure that nothing bad happens to you. You're going to be okay." She wasn't sure if the baby could understand her words, but the tone was what mattered. She knew that. Babies responded to tone, to the feeling beneath the words, the emotional truth of them. She could remember that now, could access memories from another lifetime, a time before she had chosen solitude, before she had built her quiet, protected world. There had been love once. There had been tenderness and care and all the things that made life worth living. She had forgotten, or she had put it away so carefully that she had stopped being able to access it. But now, looking at this tiny creature, it was all rushing back, flooding through her like a river that had finally broken through a dam. And what Margaret felt, looking at this tiny creature, was a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity, its immediacy. This baby had been placed in her care, whether by accident or by design, whether by fate or by simple coincidence. and Margaret would not let anything bad happen to her if she could help it. She would guard her fiercely. She would care for her with all the skill and love and attention that she could muster. This baby, this anonymous small person, had just become the most important thing in Margaret's life. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She found a small blanket in the back room. Nothing fancy, just a utility blanket that she sometimes put over herself when she was sitting down to rest between batches of baking. It was a soft grey colour, well worn and comfortable, and it smelled like Margaret's own familiar scent, which seemed to calm the baby somehow. It was clean and soft, and it would do for now. She wrapped it around the baby carefully, creating a cocoon of warmth, tucking the edges in gently so the baby was completely surrounded by softness and safety. The baby's eyes were beginning to droop, exhaustion finally catching up with her, the adrenaline of her abandonment and this frightening new world beginning to wear off. But before she could drift off to sleep, Margaret knew she needed to attend to the most pressing concern. The baby was hungry. Hungry babies didn't sleep well, didn't rest properly, and Margaret wanted more than anything for this baby to sleep, to recover from whatever trauma had brought her here, to know the safety and rest that she so desperately needed. Margaret carried the baby to her small kitchen area and began to think through her options with the methodical consideration she usually reserved for her baking recipes. She had milk in her refrigerator, regular cow's milk that she used in her tea and for some of her baking, for cream sauces and custards, and the silky components of her various pastries and pies. It wasn't ideal for a baby, she suspected, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. She also had cream, which was richer, more nourishing, though she wasn't sure if that was better or worse for a newborn. And she had eggs, if the baby was old enough for eggs, which she probably wasn't. She couldn't imagine feeding eggs to someone so small, so delicate, so entirely unprepared for solid food. Margaret didn't have a bottle, but she had cups and spoons, ceramic spoons that had been smoothed by her own hand over many years of use. She knew that babies could be fed with a spoon, could be given tiny amounts of liquid that way, though the image in her mind was of something delicate and difficult and possibly quite messy, something that required a steady hand and infinite patience. She decided to try it. She had no other choice. She poured a small amount of milk into a cup, testing the temperature with a spoon. It should be warm, like it would have been from its mother. She heated it over a low flame, being very careful not to overheat it. The smell of the warming milk brought back a rush of memory. Sitting in her mother's kitchen when she was a girl, watching her mother warm milk for babies. How strange that these memories had been locked away for so long. Then she sat down in the comfortable chair in her small rest area, cradled the baby carefully against her body, and offered the first tiny spoonful of milk. The baby's mouth opened instinctively, and she swallowed, her eyes opening slightly wider as though surprised by the warmth and the taste. Margaret repeated this process, slowly, patiently, one small spoon at a time, feeding this baby who had appeared on her doorstep like a gift, or a test, or both. Each spoonful was a small act of care, a small gesture of love. "There you go," Margaret murmured with each offering. "That's good. That's very good. You're doing wonderfully." The baby drank slowly, stopping after only a few spoonfuls, seeming satisfied with even that small amount. Perhaps she had already eaten before being left at the bakery. Perhaps someone had fed her before making the heartbreaking decision to leave her. Margaret set the cup down and held the baby against her chest, patting her back the way she remembered mothers doing, the way her own mother had done for her so many years ago, making slow circles between the baby's tiny shoulder blades. The patting was rhythmic, hypnotic, meant to help with digestion and to continue the soothing process that the milk and warmth had begun. The baby made a small noise, almost like a sigh, a sound of contentment or resignation or both, and then seemed to drift off into sleep, her body going limp in Margaret's arms her breathing becoming deep and regular, her little fists uncurling as the tension finally left her small frame. Margaret sat in the soft light of early morning, holding this sleeping baby, and felt something shift inside her. It was as though a door that had been closed for years had suddenly opened, letting light pour through it, illuminating corners she had forgotten about, memories she had locked away. She thought about the life she had been living, solitary, yes, but not unhappy, purposeful in its own way. But it had been a life lived in only one register, one note played repeatedly. This small creature was playing a different note, one she had thought was lost to her forever. The sun was beginning to rise. Margaret could see the light changing outside her windows, the darkness giving way to pale grey dawn. In another hour, she would normally begin her baking: cinnamon rolls, croissants, tarts, bread. Her customers would be arriving soon, expecting the bakery to smell like butter and cinnamon and fresh bread. Margaret looked down at the baby sleeping in her arms and realised she had no idea how she was going to manage it all. The baby couldn't stay in the kitchen while Margaret worked with flour and hot ovens and sharp implements. And Margaret couldn't abandon her baking. Her customers depended on it. Some of them came specifically for things that were only available on certain days. But she would figure it out. She would have to. There was no other choice. She carried the baby carefully back to the small sofa in the back room and settled there, still holding her, not wanting to put her down, not wanting to risk the baby waking up alone and frightened, confused, and crying for a presence that wasn't there. The sofa was soft enough, and Margaret arranged the pillows around them both to create a nest of comfort and security. She could stay here while she waited for Rose to arrive. Rose would know what to do, or at least Rose would know someone who knew what to do. Rose had always been the kind of person who knew how to solve problems, how to get things done, how to help. She had raised 3 children of her own, though they were all grown now and living away, scattered across the country in their own lives. Rose would understand. The baby slept on, unaware of the chaos her arrival had created, unaware of the decisions that would need to be made, the authorities that would need to be contacted, the questions that would need to be answered. The baby simply slept, secure in the knowledge that someone was holding her, that she was safe and warm and cared for. It was the most basic form of trust, the kind that didn't require words or understanding, just the simple biological knowledge that someone was there, someone had chosen to stay. Margaret sat in the growing light, thinking about what came next, running through scenarios and possibilities, trying to imagine how this was all going to work. She was lost in these thoughts when she heard it. The sound of the front door being unlocked with a key, the familiar scrape of the lock giving way, the soft push of the door opening into the space where Margaret had spent the last 40 years of her life, building a carefully structured, predictable existence. It was Rose. Rose came in every morning at 6 o'clock, sometimes a few minutes before the bakery officially opened, to help Margaret with the baking and the initial setup for the day. She had been doing it for nearly a decade, ever since her husband had passed away, and she'd found herself with time on her hands and a desire to be useful, a need to feel needed by someone other than her already grown children who had built lives that didn't really require her anymore. Rose and Margaret had developed a rhythm, a comfortable routine that required very few words, that was based on mutual understanding and respect, and the knowledge that they were both doing what they loved, what they were meant to do. Rose would arrive, they would drink a quick cup of tea together while going over the DEA's plans, and then they would work side by side, occasionally chatting, but mostly moving in harmony, each knowing what the other was doing, anticipating needs before they were expressed. She emerged from the bakery's front counter into the back room, already talking, already settled into the rhythm of their morning routine, beginning with her usual comment about the weather or about something she had seen on the walk down here. And then she stopped. She saw Margaret sitting on the sofa, holding a baby, completely still, completely absorbed in the small person in her arms. Rose's mouth literally fell open. Her words died away unspoken. She simply stared, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Margaret," Rose said finally, her voice rising slightly, filled with confusion and concern and something that might have been excitement. "Margaret, what on earth? Is that a baby? How did you?" The questions tumbled over each other, Rose's usual composure shaken by the sight of this impossible thing. Margaret nodded slowly, meeting Rose's eyes with a calm she didn't entirely feel, but was somehow able to project. The calm came from somewhere deep inside her, from the same place that had enabled her to keep her bakery running for 40 years, through divorces and deaths, and economic downturns, and everything else that life threw at her. "She was on the doorstep this morning," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady. "When I arrived to open, I found her wrapped in this blue blanket. There was no note, there was nothing, just her. Just this baby, bundled and left on my step like an offering." Rose approached slowly, her expression shifting from shock to concern to something that looked like maternal instinct awakening. A memory of the time when she had held her own babies, a remembering of that particular weight and warmth and smell. She leaned over carefully to look at the sleeping baby's face, studying the small features with an expression of tenderness. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, a gesture of protection or perhaps of emotion that was too large to contain. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "Oh, Margaret, what are you going to do? You can't possibly, at your age, with the bakery to run." She stopped, hearing how her words sounded, seeing the way Margaret's arms tightened protectively around the baby. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that." "I don't know yet," Margaret admitted, her eyes not leaving the baby's face. "I don't know what I'm going to do. But for now, she's here. She's safe. She's warm. And she's sleeping. That's all I know for certain right now. Everything else can wait. Everything else can be figured out. But this baby is here, and I'm going to care for her. And that's the only thing that matters at this moment." Rose pulled up a chair and sat down beside Margaret. They sat in silence for a long moment, just looking at the baby. Rose's eyes were wet with tears. "She's beautiful," Rose said finally, her voice soft and full of wonder. "She's absolutely beautiful. And she has your eyes, Margaret. Look at how she's looking at you, even in her sleep. She knows. Somehow she knows that you're taking care of her." Word spread through the neighborhood, not through Margaret's intention, but through the presence of something unusual that demanded to be talked about. By 8 o'clock, her first customer arrived. Seamus, who had been coming to her bakery for nearly 30 years. He came in expecting his usual coffee and cinnamon roll, but instead found Margaret in the kitchen looking overwhelmed, with Rose nearby with flour on her apron, and a baby in a makeshift bassinet that Rose had constructed from a bread basket lined with aprons. Seamus took one look at the situation and asked no questions. He simply asked, "What do you need?" That simple question opened a door. Word spread from Seamus to the next customer and from her to the next. By mid-morning, Margaret's bakery had become a gathering place where people came with help. Catherine from the drugstore arrived with bottles, formula, diapers, tiny undershirts and blankets. Her sister had just had a baby, and she knew what a newborn required. She held the baby so Margaret could stretch, offering advice about feeding and sleep patterns. Douglas from the hardware store appeared with his experience from raising 5 children. He talked to Margaret about proper feeding amounts and the importance of rest, reminding her that she couldn't do this alone. Rose managed the baking while monitoring the baby and keeping the ovens at the right temperature. It was a monumental task, but Rose rose to meet it with grace and determination. Margaret sat on a stool with the baby in a soft sling that Rose had borrowed. allowing her to rest while keeping the baby close. Other customers packaged the finished goods, arranged pastries in boxes with care, and restocked the display cases. Margaret's bakery, normally a quiet, solitary place where only she worked, had transformed into something bustling and full of purpose and community. The baby, whose name remained unknown, had brought with her an energy that hadn't existed in this space before. By afternoon, as the day began to wind down and the initial rush of helpers and well-wishers began to taper off, there were questions that couldn't be avoided anymore. They hung in the air like something waiting to be spoken, something that everyone was thinking about, but no one wanted to be the first to voice. What was going to happen to the baby? She couldn't stay at the bakery forever, though Margaret found herself resistant even to the thought of the word forever, as though saying it aloud might jinx something. Margaret was 72 years old. She wasn't equipped to raise an infant. She didn't have experience with the long-term care that a baby would require. And she had a business to run, a bakery that people depended on, that had been her life's work for 4 decades, and couldn't simply be abandoned or neglected. These were the practical concerns that people began to voice carefully, gently, trying not to be cruel or judgmental, but needing to acknowledge the reality of the situation, the impossible mathematics of what Margaret was trying to do. Margaret listened to all of it, the well-meaning advice, the gentle suggestions, the practical objections. She held the baby close, feeling her small weight in her arms, and felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders, heavier than anything she had carried in a very long time. It was late afternoon, the light beginning to change from the brightness of midday to something warmer and more golden. When Margaret finally made the call she knew she had to make. She sat in the back room with the baby still in her arms, sleeping now, exhausted from the excitement of the day and the novelty of so many hands, so many voices, so many new people in her small world. Margaret used the phone on the wall, an old rotary phone that she had used for 40 years for business matters and emergencies. Yes. Oh, she called the police, the non-emergency line, and spoke quietly to an officer on the other end of the line, a woman with a kind voice who listened patiently as Margaret explained the situation. The officer responded with a gentleness that surprised Margaret, as though she had heard this story before, as though there was a protocol for this kind of thing, for babies appearing on doorsteps with no explanation. The officer explained the procedures that existed for this kind of situation, walking Margaret through the process with compassion and clarity. There would be an investigation, the officer explained gently, her voice steady and reassuring. The police would look for any record of a missing infant, would check if the baby had been reported stolen or taken, would try to locate parents or family members who might be looking for this child. Social services would become involved. There would be processes and protocols and waiting periods, bureaucracy that would need to be navigated. But in the meantime, the baby could stay with Margaret if that was what Margaret wanted. If Margaret wanted to be her temporary guardian, her foster parent while things were sorted out, that could be arranged. The officer seemed almost to be hoping that Margaret would say yes, as though some part of her understood what Margaret was beginning to understand about herself, that there was something in this baby's arrival that had meaning, that had purpose, that was meant to be. Margaret asked the officer about requirements, about what she would need to do to be approved as a temporary foster parent. The officer explained it patiently. There would be a home visit, a background check, some paperwork to fill out. It wasn't as complicated as permanent adoption, but it wasn't nothing either. Margaret listened to all of it, and before she even fully understood what she was doing, she heard herself saying it. "I want to keep her," Margaret found herself saying, the words surprising her even as they came out, as though they had originated from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from some place inside her that had been waiting for this moment, without her knowing it. "For now, at least, I want to keep her safe and well cared for until we know what's supposed to happen, until we figure out where she came from and whether there are people looking for her. But for now, yes, Yes, I want to be responsible for her. I want to care for her. The officer made notes, asked a few more questions about Margaret's living situation, her experience with children, her support system. Margaret answered them as honestly as she could, and the officer seemed satisfied. She assured Margaret that someone from the local family services office would be in touch within a day or two to conduct a home visit and go over the next steps. But for tonight, for now, the baby would be Margaret's. Legally, temporarily, the designation uncertain and flexible, but existing nonetheless. In the way that mattered most, in the way that mattered to the baby, who had no one else, who had been placed on a doorstep and abandoned to an uncertain fate, Margaret would be responsible. Margaret would be the one who made decisions. Margaret would be the guardian, the protector, the one who had said yes when the world could have easily said no. As the afternoon light changed and shifted across the bakery's display cases, casting golden rectangles across the tile floor, as customers gradually trickled away toward their homes and their own lives and their own responsibilities, the bakery returned to something resembling its normal state. The chaos of the day gradually subsided. The extra hands disappeared. The phone stopped ringing with people calling to ask if they could help, or if they had heard correctly about the baby. Margaret sat in the back room with Rose still nearby, both of them tired but content in that particular way that came from exertion in service of something meaningful. The baby was awake now, her dark eyes alert and searching, her tiny fingers wrapped around Margaret's thumb with a grip that seemed impossibly strong for something so small. People had brought supplies throughout the day, formula and bottles and diapers stacked on shelves now, tiny clothes folded carefully on a chair, blankets and a small bassinet someone had lent them, pacifiers and toys and books about baby care. There were offers of help written down on pieces of paper, phone numbers and names and specific times when people had promised to come by to assist with the baking or to sit with the baby so Margaret could rest. There would be decisions to make, arrangements to figure out, authorities to cooperate with, investigations to support. But standing above all of that, larger than all of that, was this simple fact. A baby had come into Margaret's life, placed there by some force she didn't understand and might never understand, appeared on her doorstep like a message from the universe, or like simple bad luck, or like pure chance. And Margaret had chosen without hesitation to open her heart, to accept the responsibility, to say yes to something she hadn't planned for, and could never have anticipated even if she had tried. The bakery would look different now. The daily rhythm would need to change. Her life would look different. The quiet, solitary rhythm that had sustained her through decades of loneliness and choice, that had provided comfort and purpose and structure, would need to accommodate this new presence, this new small beating heart that depended entirely on her for survival and growth and love. It would be harder. It would be messier. It would require sacrifices she couldn't yet imagine, changes to her routines that she had thought were set in stone, decisions about her own needs and comfort that would have to be made in light of this baby's greater needs. But looking down at the baby's face as the golden light of late afternoon illuminated her small features, feeling the weight of her in her arms, the reality of her existence, the truth of her dependency, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth it, that it would be worth it, that sometimes the most important moments in life arrive unannounced, unexpected, placed gently in our care when we least expect them, asking only that we be brave enough to open ourselves to them, to say yes without knowing what comes next, to accept love even when it arrives in the most surprising forms. The first week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small victories. Margaret discovered that the baby, whom she had begun calling Grace, because that was what her arrival had been, a grace, an unearned gift, had a schedule that bore no resemblance to Margaret's carefully ordered daily rhythms. Grace would sleep for 3 hours in the afternoon, then wake at midnight, with an urgency that demanded immediate attention. She would cry in the early morning hours, hungry and wet and uncertain of this world she had been thrust into. Margaret would stumble through the darkness, her body operating on muscle memory and determination, doing all the things that needed doing with hands that were gentle even when she was so tired she could barely see straight. There was something almost hypnotic about moving through a house in near darkness, following only the sound of a baby's cries as a guide. The darkness itself became familiar, became intimate. Margaret would navigate from her bed to the kitchen to the back room of the bakery with her eyes barely open, her other senses heightened, attuned to the baby's needs. She learned to tell the difference between a cry of hunger and a cry of discomfort, between the frustration of a wet diaper and the distress of an infant who simply needed to be held, who needed reassurance that someone was there, that she hadn't been abandoned again, that this new world, so large and overwhelming and incomprehensible, contained at least one person who would come when she cried. The bakery became something different during those early days, something almost unrecognizable compared to its previous incarnation. The spotless counters now held bottles and diapers alongside flour and sugar. Margaret's precise, solitary workspace became a territory shared with sleeping baby equipment, soft blankets, and the sounds of infant life. The smell of the bakery, always a carefully balanced mixture of butter, yeast, and vanilla, now included the particular sweet scent of baby powder and the slightly sour smell of spit-up that Margaret could never quite manage to fully clean up before it would happen again. Nothing was ruined by this intrusion. Nothing was made worse. If anything, the bakery began to feel less like a museum of Margaret's solitude and more like a home, messy, imperfect, full of life. Margaret had spent 40 years maintaining order in this space, maintaining control over every element, from the temperature of the ovens to the precise arrangement of pastries in the display case. Everything had its place. Everything followed a logic that Margaret had established and refined over decades. Now that logic had been upended, there were cloth diapers drying on a rack near the pastry station. There were bottles in the sink alongside Margaret's measuring cups and mixing bowls. There was baby formula powder that got dusted across the counters no matter how careful Margaret tried to be. And Grace's tiny clothes hung on a line that Rose had strung up in one corner. Baby garments drying alongside the kitchen towels that Margaret had always kept so pristine and perfect. In another version of herself, Margaret might have found this chaos intolerable. In another version of herself, she might have fought against it, tried to maintain the boundaries between infant care and her precious baking space. But this Margaret, the Margaret who had held a baby on her doorstep and chosen without hesitation to open her heart, this Margaret found that the chaos was actually comforting. It was evidence that this was real, that the baby was real, that the transformation of her life was not a dream, but an actual, tangible thing happening in the very space where she had spent so many solitary years. Rose continued to arrive at 6 in the morning, as she had for nearly a decade, but now she came prepared for something entirely different than the quiet baking routine they had established. She would come through the door already unbuttoning her coat, already asking about Grace, already reading Margaret's face to determine the status of the night that had just passed. Some mornings, Margaret would be animated and talkative, energized by a baby who had slept better, who had eaten well, who seemed to be settling into this new existence. Other mornings, Margaret would be hollowed out, operating on fumes, sustained only by caffeine and the knowledge that Grace depended on her, that there was no option for rest, even when rest was the only thing she wanted. "Sit down," Rose would say on those mornings, gently pushing Margaret toward a chair. "I'll handle this. You just hold the baby and breathe. That's all you need to do right now." And Margaret would sit, holding Grace against her chest, feeling the small, warm weight of her, and would find that just the act of sitting, of allowing someone else to take over the work, could be restorative. Rose would move through the kitchen with a practiced ease that came from years of helping Margaret. But now she moved with even greater care, conscious of the baby sleeping in Margaret's arms, keeping her voice low, keeping the noise minimal, even when she had to open the oven and let out a rush of heat that might wake Grace if she wasn't careful. Seamus was the first customer to arrive each morning, just as he always had been, appearing at 6:30 with his newspaper already unfolded under his arm. But now he came in and went straight to Margaret, not to order his coffee, but to inquire about the baby, to ask how Grace had slept, to study her face with an intensity that suggested he was looking for signs of health or happiness, evidence that Margaret was managing to keep this child alive and thriving. He would sit at his usual table by the window, cradling his coffee in his weathered hands, and would watch Margaret as she worked, would watch as she paused to check on the baby, would watch as she moved between the simple routines of preparing bread and the new routines of infant care. And something in his expression suggested that he understood what was happening, that he recognized the magnitude of what Margaret was attempting. Catherine from the drugstore became a regular visitor, arriving not just to purchase pastries but to deliver supplies, more formula, more diapers, tiny socks that she had knitted herself, books about infant development that Margaret read in the quiet hours of night when she was awake with Grace and desperate for guidance. Catherine had raised 3 children of her own, and while the oldest was now in college and the younger 2 were teenagers, she seemed to access some maternal instinct that remained dormant in the rest of her life, that came alive only in the presence of this baby. She would hold Grace while Margaret worked, would give Margaret a chance to focus on the baking without the constant awareness of the baby's needs tugging at the back of her mind. One morning, Catherine arrived with a stack of handwritten notes about infant care, suggestions from people in the community who had children or grandchildren, advice offered with genuine care, and the understanding that Margaret was attempting something unprecedented for her. How to soothe a fussy baby, when to worry about a fever, how to know if the baby was eating enough. The notes were decorated with little drawings, with underlines and exclamation marks, evidence that people cared enough to think carefully about Margaret's situation, to offer not just material support, but the gift of their accumulated knowledge. Catherine would talk about her own babies, about the things she wished she had known when she was a new mother, about the importance of being gentle with herself, of accepting help, of understanding that caring for a baby while running a business wasn't something that needed to be done perfectly, only authentically. She would sit at one of the small tables with Grace in her arms, speaking softly to the baby, calling her sweetheart and darling, using terms of endearment that came naturally from the experience of having mothered children. Margaret would listen while she worked, would absorb Catherine's quiet wisdom, would feel the absence of her own mother, gone for 15 years now, less acutely. Catherine was providing a kind of surrogate maternal guidance, a way of connecting Margaret to generations of women who had done this work before her, who had managed somehow to care for infants and maintain their own lives simultaneously. Douglas from the hardware store became an unexpected source of practical advice and emotional support. He would appear on random afternoons with supplies, a more sturdy bassinet than the makeshift breadbasket Rose had originally created, a small rocking chair that he built himself in his woodshop during his evenings, items designed to make Margaret's life easier, to improve the conditions in which she and Grace were living. He would bring his young daughter sometimes, a girl of about 10, who would sit with Grace while Douglas helped Margaret inventory the supplies that kept appearing from various corners of the community. The girl was patient and gentle with the baby, treating her with a kind of reverence that made Margaret think about how children seem to instinctively understand when something small and precious needed careful handling. The baking itself began to change. Margaret found herself creating things specifically with Grace in mind. Softer pastries that Rose could eat while holding the baby. Foods that could be managed with one hand when the other hand was occupied with holding a sleeping infant. She made fruit custards and smoothies that were more like liquid nutrition that she could consume quickly, efficiently, without requiring her full attention. She prepared batches of cookies that customers could purchase to eat at home, simple configurations that Rose could manage even if Margaret was occupied with the baby. The rhythm of her work adapted, bent, reformed itself around this new reality, and Margaret discovered that constraint could breed a different kind of creativity. She found herself working with new ingredients, things she had never used before in her carefully curated baking, softer fruits that she could puree and swirl into batters, creating beautiful color variations without the need for artificial dyes. She experimented with recipes that could be made in smaller batches, that required less active time, that could be completed in shorter bursts between feedings. It was a liberation in a strange way, this limitation. In her solitude, Margaret had had infinite time to perfect a single croissant, to achieve absolute precision in every detail. Now she was learning to find beauty in speed, in adaptability, in creating something good enough rather than something perfect. She found that she could still make beautiful things, still create food that brought joy, but now she was doing it in service of something larger than her own solitary perfection. She was doing it as part of a life that included another human being, a baby who depended on her for everything. There was a satisfaction in this that was different from the satisfaction she had known before. It wasn't about the quiet pride of a job done flawlessly. It was about creating something that would nourish the people she cared about, that would bring people together, that would make the space of the bakery feel more like a gathering place and less like a temple to Margaret's own need for control and perfection. She began to understand during those early weeks that she had been using her baking as a kind of shield, a way of keeping people at a distance while still maintaining some form of connection. By providing them with beautiful food, she could have a relationship with them without having to truly be vulnerable, without having to truly need them the way she now found herself needing Rose and Catherine and Douglas, and all of these people who had appeared in her life offering help. The baby had changed that. Grace had removed the shield, had created a situation where Margaret couldn't pretend to be self-sufficient, where she had to acknowledge her own limitations, her own need, her own desperate desire for connection and help and support. 2 weeks in, on a Wednesday morning, Margaret was kneading dough for bread when Grace woke up hungry. The baby's cry started soft and escalated quickly to the demanding wail that meant she couldn't wait, that her hunger was immediate and pressing. Margaret's hands were covered in sticky dough, flour dusting her apron, the bread in the early stages of the process that couldn't simply be abandoned. She looked at Rose, who was already moving, washing her hands, taking over at the counter where Margaret had been working. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel and carried Grace to the back room, settling into the comfortable chair with a bottle that was already waiting, warmed and ready. Grace latched onto the bottle with intensity, her small hands wrapping around Margaret's thumb, her eyes fixed on Margaret's face with that searching quality that Margaret had come to recognize. The baby was studying her, learning her face, beginning to associate Margaret with nourishment and safety and comfort. It was extraordinary, this process of being recognized, of mattering so completely to another person. Margaret had spent 40 years working in solitude, creating beautiful things, finding satisfaction in the perfection of her craft, in the appreciation of customers who knew quality when they tasted it. But this simple process of feeding a baby, of being needed in such a fundamental and unquestionable way, this was something different entirely. This was purpose in its most raw, most essential form. When Grace had finished eating, Margaret carried her back out into the bakery proper, settling her into the small bassinet that Douglas had crafted, which now occupied a warm corner near the ovens, far enough back that Margaret could see her constantly, but far enough forward that she could still work without feeling that the baby was in danger from heat or sharp edges, or any of the 100 small hazards that a bakery presented. Rose had managed the bread, shaping it, getting it ready for the oven. She looked at Margaret with that knowing expression that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. The expression that said, "I know you're barely holding it together. I see how hard you're working. I understand how much of yourself you're pouring into this. But I'm here, so you're not alone." Customers began to arrive. Some came specifically to see Grace, to inquire about her health and progress, to offer advice or encouragement. Others came because it was Wednesday, and they came to the bakery on Wednesdays, and they found the space transformed by the presence of this baby who had arrived on Margaret's doorstep and changed everything. The atmosphere in the shop became softer somehow, warmer. People lingered longer. Conversations drifted towards stories about their own children, their own grandchildren, memories of the early days of parenthood with all its chaos and joy and exhaustion. The bakery became a gathering place not just for the consumption of food, but for the sharing of stories, for the creation of community in a way that it had been perhaps before Margaret had chosen solitude, before she had structured her life to require as little human connection as possible. 3 weeks after Grace arrived, there was a morning where Margaret realised she had not thought about the life she'd had before. She was so consumed with the baby, so focused on the immediate demands of each day, that the years of solitude seemed to exist in some distant past, something that had happened to someone else, another version of herself. She fed Grace at dawn, changed her diaper with hands that had become increasingly confident in this new skill, dressed her in one of the tiny outfits that Catherine had brought, and settled her into the bassinet while Margaret began her morning work. The oven was preheating. Margaret's hands were back in the dough, the familiar muscle memory of kneading beginning to warm her muscles, to settle her into the rhythm that had been the foundation of her life for 4 decades. But now, as she worked, she sang softly, songs she remembered from childhood, lullabies that seemed to surface from memory, as though they had been waiting all along for her to remember them. Grace listened, her eyes tracking Margaret's movements, her small face alert and engaged with this woman who had become the entire world to her. By the 4th week, Margaret had established a new routine, something that looked chaotic and impossible from the outside, but felt almost natural from within it. She would wake at 4 in the morning, feed Grace, put her back down, and begin the baking. Rose would arrive at 6 and would take over watching the baby while Margaret worked. By 7:30, the first customers would begin to trickle in, and the rhythm would shift again. Margaret would have to stop her baking periodically to attend to Grace, to feed her or change her, or simply to hold her and rock her, and then she would return to the work, her hands moving between baby and dough, between formula and flour, managing somehow to accomplish both things, even when neither seemed like they should be possible to do simultaneously. Seamus had fallen into a pattern of arriving not for the coffee, so much as for the chance to sit with Grace, to hold her while Margaret worked, to let the baby wrap her small fingers around his, and to spend time in the presence of this small creature who had arrived in Margaret's life with no warning and no explanation. He would sit at his table and hold the baby, talking to her in a low voice about the news in his paper, about things he had seen in the neighbourhood, about his memories of raising his own children decades ago. Grace seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice, the steadiness of his presence, the patience with which he held her. Other customers began to establish their own relationships with the baby. A woman named Martha, who came in every Thursday, started bringing supplies, more diapers, more formula, sometimes clothes that her own grandchildren had outgrown. A young man who worked at the bank down the street would pop in during his lunch break, just to hold the baby for a few minutes, to take a break from the stress of his job and sit in the presence of this small being who had no demands except the most basic ones. The baby seemed to accept all of this attention without flinching, seemed to understand on some level that she was surrounded by people who cared for her, who wanted her to thrive, who had adopted her into their community simply because she existed and needed care. Margaret found herself watching this unfold with a sense of wonder. She had spent so many years structuring her life around solitude, convincing herself that she didn't need other people. that the community she had built was sufficient. A transactional relationship where she provided beautiful food and customers provided money and appreciation. But now she was experiencing something different, something that looked less like transaction and more like genuine connection, like the kind of interdependence that came from shared commitment to someone small and vulnerable and worthy of love. One afternoon, as Margaret was pulling a batch of cinnamon rolls from the oven, she found herself thinking about the mother who had left this baby on her doorstep. She thought about what desperation had driven that choice. What impossible circumstances had led someone to make the decision to leave their child in the care of a stranger. She thought about whether that mother was somewhere, worrying about the baby, wondering if her decision had been the right one, if this baby was being cared for properly, if she would ever be reunited with her child. The police investigation had turned up no leads, no missing baby reports matching Grace's description, no frantic search on social media or in the news. It was as though Grace had materialized from nowhere, had been left on Margaret's doorstep by someone who had vanished without a trace, leaving only this small person and the unanswered questions of her origin. Margaret had promised to cooperate with any investigation, to help if answers ever emerged about where Grace came from. But as days turned into weeks, as Grace became more integrated into the life of the bakery and the community that surrounded it, Margaret found herself less focused on questions of origin and more focused on the reality of the present moment, on the fact that this baby was here, was in her care, was responding to love and warmth and attention with the kind of openness that only an infant could manage. The social services visit had gone smoothly, the caseworker approving Margaret as a temporary foster parent, documenting the community support, noting the baby's apparent health and well-being. There would be ongoing home visits, ongoing paperwork, ongoing bureaucratic processes that would need to be maintained. But for now, legally and practically, Grace was Margaret's responsibility, Margaret's charge, Margaret's child in the way that mattered most, in the daily care, in the moment-to-moment decisions about her well-being, in the fierce protectiveness that Margaret felt whenever anyone held the baby or made decisions about her care. Late one evening, after the bakery had closed and Rose had gone home and the overnight batch of bread was rising on the counter, Margaret sat in the back room with Grace, who was beginning to develop the rhythm of sleeping through more of the night. The baby was in the bassinet, swaddled in soft blankets, her small chest rising and falling with the peaceful breathing of deep sleep. Margaret was holding a cup of tea, warm and comforting, and she was thinking about time, about how much of a human life could change in just a few weeks, how complete a transformation could happen almost without notice. The kitchen was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt different than the solitude Margaret had known before. This was a quiet that existed alongside presence, alongside the knowledge that another person was sleeping nearby, that she was responsible for that person, that her choices mattered in ways they never had before. Outside the window, the street was dark and peaceful. The neighbours' houses were dark, except for the occasional glow of a television or a nightlight in a window. Margaret was aware of all of them. All of these people living their lives, most of whom she had barely spoken to in 40 years of living on this street, most of whom she had acknowledged only through the transactional relationship of selling them bread and pastries. But now she knew them. Seamus and his memories of raising children, Catherine and her quiet wisdom about motherhood, Douglas and his gentle strength, his willingness to build something for someone else's need, Martha and her compassion, her ability to see a baby and immediately understand what was needed. These people had become part of her life, not through any conscious choice, but through the simple fact that Grace existed, that Grace needed care, that Grace's arrival had created a circumstance that required community. She thought about the Margaret who had existed 5 weeks ago, the woman who had woken up alone, who had worked alone, who had eaten lunch alone, who had gone to bed alone every single night of the year. She thought about how that woman had seemed content, had seemed to have built something sustainable and reasonable. But looking at her life now, at the chaos and the interruption, and the constant attention that caring for Grace demanded, Margaret couldn't imagine going back to that solitude. It seemed impossible that she had lived like that she had accepted that aloneness as the necessary price for independence and control. She hadn't understood, not really, what she was missing, what the presence of another person could bring to a life. Looking at Grace's sleeping face, at the way her tiny mouth was slightly open, at the impossibly long eyelashes that lay against her cheeks, Margaret felt something shift in her chest. It was gratitude, but it was also something deeper than gratitude. It was a recognition of how much of her own humanity she had been denying, how much she had been willing to sacrifice in exchange for the illusion of control. This baby had taken that away from her, and in taking it away, had given her something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that she was capable of love, that she was capable of being needed, that her life could have meaning beyond her own small sphere of influence and pride. The next morning would bring new challenges. Grace would wake hungry in the middle of Margaret's most critical baking window. A customer would arrive in the middle of a delicate pastry construction, and Margaret would have to stop, would have to shift her attention, would have to manage both things simultaneously. The work would be harder than it had ever been, and the satisfaction would be deeper, more complex, more real. And Margaret would do it all again, would do it gladly, would do it with the knowledge that this small person depended on her, that her choices mattered, that her presence in the world was significant not just to herself, but to this baby who had been placed in her care by forces she didn't understand and might never fully comprehend. 2 months passed, and Grace had become as much a part of the bakery's fabric as the flour dust that seemed to live permanently in the air. She had grown in those 8 weeks, had filled out, her tiny features becoming more distinct as the newborn softness began to give way to the particular expression that was uniquely hers. Her eyes had shifted from the dark blue of infancy to a green-grey colour that Margaret found endlessly fascinating, a colour that reminded her of the sky before a storm, changeable and full of possibility. The social services caseworker had made 3 visits now, each one less formal than the last. On the most recent visit, Sandra, the caseworker, had arrived with a particular expression that Margaret had come to recognise as containing important news. They sat in the small back room of the bakery after closing time, with Grace asleep in her bassinet nearby. And Sandra had explained that there had been no claims on the child, no desperate mother appearing with identification and proof of parentage, no family members stepping forward with proof of relation. The legal process was moving forward, Sandra explained, and Margaret would need to make a decision. There were several options available. The state could place Grace in the traditional foster care system and continue searching for biological family, though at this point, 8 weeks in with no contacts, the likelihood seemed to diminish with each passing day. Alternatively, if Margaret wished to pursue it, there was a pathway to formal adoption. It would require home studies and court appearances and paperwork that seemed to span several reams, but it was possible, Sandra said, meeting Margaret's eyes with something that looked like hope. She talked about Margaret's fitness as a parent, about the quality of care she had already provided, about the way that the community had rallied around her and the baby. She spoke about how rare it was to see a single woman, approaching her senior years, make such a commitment. But Margaret had shown herself to be capable and loving, had demonstrated that she could manage both the demands of a business and the needs of an infant, had created a support system that would benefit Grace immeasurably. Margaret listened carefully, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold while she was paying attention to Sandra's words. She thought about what it would mean to make Grace legally hers, to stand in front of a judge and declare that this baby was her child, that she would raise her, support her, love her through all the years of childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. She thought about the responsibility, the permanence, the irreversible nature of such a choice. She thought about how this decision would reshape her entire existence, would mean that her own needs and desires would never again come first. would require a constant sacrifice of her own comfort for another person's welfare. It was an enormous thing to contemplate. And yet, when she looked at Grace's sleeping face, at the way her small chest rose and fell with breath, at the absolute trust that this baby placed in her, she realized that she had already made the choice weeks ago, on the morning Grace had arrived on her doorstep. Everything since then had been simply a matter of moving toward what her heart had already decided. There was no real decision to be made now. The only decision that remained was whether she would have the courage to commit to it formally, whether she would allow the law and society to recognize what was already true in the deepest part of her being. "I want to adopt her," Margaret said to Sandra. "I want to make her my daughter." Sandra nodded, as though she had expected this answer, as though she had witnessed this same transformation happen many times before in her years working in child welfare. She explained the next steps, the timeline, the costs, the preparation that would be required. There would be interviews, background checks, home studies that Margaret would need to pass. The adoption would likely take 6 months to a year, possibly longer, depending on how quickly the courts moved and whether any family members emerged to claim the child. But Margaret would have legal guardianship beginning immediately, which meant she could make medical decisions, could enroll Grace in programs, could move forward with the practical aspects of parenting while the legal process unfolded in the background. When Sandra left that evening, Margaret sat alone in the quiet bakery for a long time, watching Grace sleep. She thought about the mother who had left this baby, and she found that the anger she might have expected to feel was absent. Instead, there was a kind of compassion, a recognition that whatever circumstances had driven that mother to make such a choice, they must have been desperate indeed. Margaret understood now something she hadn't understood before, when her life had been solitary and uncomplicated. She understood the raw need to care for another person, the way that instinct could override logic, the way that love could make you capable of impossible things. She hoped, wherever that mother was, that she had found peace, that she had found the help she needed, that her life had taken a turn towards something better. And she was grateful, profoundly grateful, that this baby had found her way to Margaret's doorstep, that the choice had been made for her by forces beyond her understanding. The community learned of Margaret's intention to adopt Grace before the paperwork had even been filed. Seamus must have mentioned it to someone, or Catherine had let the news slip, or Rose had simply told people because she couldn't help but be excited about Margaret's future. Within days, people began to arrive with gifts, with encouragement, with offers of support. Martha brought a crib, insisting that a baby outgrew bassinets and that Margaret should have something proper for Grace to sleep in. Douglas appeared with furniture for a nursery, pieces he had carefully crafted or restored, items that transformed a corner of Margaret's apartment above the bakery into an actual child's space. Catherine arrived with stacks of children's books, with clothes in the next several sizes up, anticipating the years ahead, thinking forward in a way that Margaret was only beginning to learn to do. The town gathered around Margaret in a way that she had never experienced before, a way that she had spent decades actively discouraging. But with Grace as the centre of attention, rather than Margaret herself, she found that she could accept the help without it feeling like a violation of her solitude. These gifts weren't for her, weren't commentary on her life choices or her need for connection. They were for Grace, offered out of love for this small person who'd arrived mysteriously and was now becoming part of the fabric of the community, woven in through the love and attention of every person who encountered her. 2 weeks before the court date for the adoption hearing, Margaret was preparing a special batch of cookies when she heard a commotion at the door. Rose burst in with an expression of barely contained excitement, pulling Margaret away from her work before she could even protest. In the seating area of the bakery, nearly every customer Margaret had served in the past 5 years had gathered. There was Seamus and his wife, whom Margaret had met only once, many years ago. There was Catherine and her entire family, including her teenage children and her elderly mother. There was Douglas and his daughter, who was holding a large banner. There were people from the bank, the hardware store, the pharmacy, the post office. There were families Margaret knew only in passing, regular customers who had become something more in the past 2 months. There were people she barely recognized, neighbors who had heard about the baby and had come simply because they wanted to be part of this moment. The banner read, "Welcome to the family Grace," in letters that the children had decorated with glitter and drawings of hearts and stars and tiny footprints. The sparkles caught the light from the bakery lamps, creating little dancing reflections on the walls and ceiling, transforming the simple space into something magical. There was a cake decorated with clouds and a quote that Margaret only half registered through her tears. "Family is where the heart is." Someone had taken the time to hand-paint tiny images of the bakery on the cake's sides, complete with the multicolored door and little figures standing in the windows. Seamus presented her with a beautiful certificate that had been designed by someone at the bank, a memento to commemorate the adoption, with Grace's name inscribed in calligraphy. The parchment was thick and elegant, the kind of document that would last for years, something Grace could eventually frame in her own home. Catherine gave her a handwritten book of recipes from all the people gathered in the room, family recipes that they had contributed, creating a kind of edible history that Grace would someday inherit. Each recipe was accompanied by a short note about why that particular dish mattered, what memories were attached to it, what love had gone into preparing it over the years. Margaret stood in the centre of this room full of people and felt something shift inside her. She thought about the woman she had been just 3 months ago, isolated and self-sufficient, and convinced that this was the life she had chosen, the life that made sense, given what she had experienced. She thought about how much had changed, how completely her world had been turned inside out by the arrival of a baby she had never expected, by the necessity of connection, by the undeniable proof that none of us are really meant to be alone. She held Grace in her arms that evening as the party continued around her, as people offered toasts and shared memories, and told her how much her bakery had meant to them over the years, how much Grace meant to them now. The baby was awake and alert, observing the gathered crowd with the quiet wonder that small infants seem to possess, taking in all of these people who had already chosen to love her, to be part of her story, to welcome her into the community as though she had always been meant to be here. 3 days before the adoption was to be finalised, Margaret was closing the bakery in the early evening when a young woman appeared at the door. She looked to be in her mid-20s, thin and worn in a way that spoke of hardship, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and eyes that were red from crying. She asked hesitantly if Margaret had a baby, if there was a baby here, if by any chance Margaret had found a newborn 2 months ago. Margaret's heart seemed to stop in her chest. She looked at this woman, trying to see if there was any feature of Grace in her face, if this was the mother who had left her daughter on Margaret's doorstep. She said yes, carefully, and asked who was asking. The woman's name was Jennifer. She had been living in her car 2 months ago, pregnant, terrified, with no resources and no support. She had given birth in a hospital clinic and had immediately been faced with the knowledge that she couldn't care for an infant, that she had nothing to offer, that the kindest thing she could do was to leave her daughter somewhere safe, somewhere she might be found, somewhere she might have a chance at a real life. She had written Margaret's address on a piece of paper and had left it with the baby because Margaret had been kind to her weeks before, had given her a free pastry and a cup of tea when Jennifer had stopped by the bakery, had treated her like a human being when most of the world seemed to be treating her like a problem to be solved. Jennifer explained that she had spent 2 months living on the streets, getting sober, accepting help from a women's shelter, rebuilding her life. She had gotten a job at a grocery store. She had found a small apartment. She had been trying to get herself to a place where she could be a mother, where she could provide something for her daughter. But she also understood that she might be too late, that her daughter might have already bonded with someone else, that asking for her back after having made the choice to leave might be the most selfish thing she could do. Margaret invited Jennifer inside. She led her to the back room where Grace was sleeping in her crib, and Jennifer looked at her daughter for what might have been the first time since she had left her on the doorstep. She wept silently, her whole body shaking with the force of her emotion, as she looked at this baby who had been taken care of, who was healthy and loved and safe. Jennifer reached out a trembling hand to touch the baby's cheek, so gently, as though she was afraid that even the lightest touch might disturb this fragile being. Margaret made tea. She sat with Jennifer and listened to her story, to the desperation that had driven her choices, to the months of work to rebuild herself into someone who might deserve to be a mother. Jennifer spoke about the homeless shelters where she had stayed, about the counselors who had helped her understand her own addiction, about the job training program that had given her new skills and new hope. She spoke about lying awake at night, wondering if her daughter was safe, if she was being cared for, if the choice she had made had been the right one. She spoke about visiting the bakery in those early weeks and seeing Grace in the window, seeing Margaret holding her, and knowing in that moment that she had made the right decision, even though it had cost her everything. And when Jennifer finally asked if she could have her daughter back, Margaret felt the weight of this question, the magnitude of what Jennifer was asking. Margaret could say no. She could refuse, could tell Jennifer that she was too late, that Grace was hers now, that the legal process would protect her claim. But as Margaret looked at Jennifer's face, at the raw pain and longing there, she found herself saying something that surprised her, even as she said it. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that we could figure out a different arrangement. I'm adopting Grace in 2 days. The adoption is going to be finalized. But that doesn't mean you have to be out of her life. You could be part of her story, part of her family, if you wanted to be. We could do this together. Grace could know you, could grow up knowing that her mother loved her, that her mother made a brave choice because she wanted better for her. We could make this work if you're willing to try." Jennifer stared at Margaret as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. She asked if Margaret was serious, if this was really something Margaret would be willing to do. Margaret thought about all the ways her life had been transformed by this baby, about the community that had formed around Grace, about the understanding she had developed that family didn't have to look the way she had always assumed it should look. She thought about how Grace would someday want to know where she came from, who her mother was, what circumstances had led to her arrival on Margaret's doorstep. And she thought that the most loving thing Margaret could do was to help Grace know and understand her own origin story, to help her connect with the woman who had carried her and loved her enough to make an impossible choice. "Yes," Margaret said, "I'm serious. Let's figure out how to do this together." Jennifer started coming to the bakery 3 times a week. She would hold Grace while Margaret worked, and slowly, carefully, a bond began to form between mother and daughter, mediated by Margaret, supported by the community that had gathered around Grace, allowed to develop in the open rather than in secrecy or shame. Margaret adjusted her adoption paperwork to include Jennifer as someone with visitation rights and input into major decisions about Grace's upbringing. She worked with a lawyer and a social worker to create an arrangement that was unusual but not unprecedented, a kind of open adoption that acknowledged Jennifer's role in Grace's life, while also protecting the relationship that had formed between Margaret and her adopted daughter. 6 months after Grace had arrived on Margaret's doorstep, the bakery hosted a small celebration. Jennifer had been offered a full-time position at the grocery store, had gotten her own apartment with enough room for Grace to visit overnight, and was taking parenting classes and preparing to be not just a biological mother, but an actual present mother in Grace's life. Margaret was Grace's legal parent, her guardian, the person who would do most of the day-to-day care and decision-making. And the community that had gathered around all of them was witnessing something that most of them had never seen before, a situation where the neat lines between family and community, between biological relationship and chosen relationship, were blurred and reformed into something more complex and more honest. Grace was 6 months old now, no longer a newborn but a baby with personality and preferences and opinions about the world. She had learned to laugh, a sound that filled the bakery with joy every time she made it. She had learned to reach for Margaret, to make eye contact, to show preference for certain people in her life. She would sit in her high chair in the corner of the bakery while Margaret worked, watching the world go by, occasionally letting out a squeal of pure delight when something caught her fancy. On the day of the celebration, Margaret stood behind the counter and looked out at the people gathered in her shop. Seamus was there, of course, reading his newspaper in his usual spot, but with one hand free to wave at Grace whenever she looked his way. Catherine had brought her entire family. Douglas had brought his daughter, who had become one of Grace's favourite people, someone she would reach for and smile at with an intensity that seemed to come from the deep recognition that this person loved her. Jennifer was there too, sitting at a table with Margaret's social worker, discussing plans for overnight visits and how to manage the logistics of a life that was going to become increasingly complex as Grace grew and developed and began to understand the unusual circumstances of her own family. Margaret thought about the woman she had been just 6 months ago, the woman who had seemed so complete in her solitude, so satisfied with the rhythms of her own carefully constructed life. That woman had taken pride in her self-sufficiency, had worn her aloneness like a badge of honour, had convinced herself that needing others was a weakness rather than an essential part of being human. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. This new Margaret, the Margaret who was a mother, who was part of a community, who had learned that the greatest satisfactions came not from perfect control, but from the messy, complicated, wonderful reality of connection and love. This Margaret was someone she barely recognised. But it was an unrecognition that came from growth, from transformation, from the knowledge that she had been living a partial life and had somehow, through the appearance of a baby on her doorstep, stumbled into something more complete and more real. She had spent 40 years learning to make perfect bread, and it had taken 8 weeks with a baby to teach her what really mattered. Grace reached out her small hand and grasped Margaret's finger, a gesture she had done 1,000 times, but one that never failed to move Margaret deeply. This baby, this unexpected arrival, this gift that had appeared from nowhere and had changed everything, was hers now. The adoption was finalised. The paperwork was signed. The law recognised what had already been true in Margaret's heart from the very beginning. This was her daughter. This was her family. This was the life she had somehow been waiting for, without even knowing that she was waiting. The bakery smelled like bread and butter and sugar, like home. It sounded like laughter and conversation, and the happy murmur of people who had chosen to spend their evening gathered together. Grace was held by Catherine now, content to be passed from person to person because she had learned early that the world was full of people who loved her, who wanted to be part of her life, who had opened their hearts because one old woman had made the choice to do the same. Margaret moved through the kitchen, preparing food, making coffee, serving tea, doing all the things that had always defined her work in this space, but now she did it with a different understanding of what it meant, a different recognition of the purpose behind the action. She wasn't just providing food, she was creating a gathering place, a home, a community. She was doing the work of love in the most practical way that she knew how. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Jennifer lingered at the counter, watching Margaret pack up some leftover pastries to send home with her. Jennifer said that she'd been thinking a lot about forgiveness, about whether Margaret had forgiven her for leaving Grace on the doorstep, about whether Margaret could understand the desperation that had driven such a choice. Margaret paused in her work and looked at Jennifer, really looked at her. She saw in this young woman someone who had faced impossible circumstances and who had chosen to try, who had worked hard to rebuild herself, who was now showing up as a mother even though the path had been complicated and painful. She saw someone who was doing the best she could with what she had, and she recognized something of herself in that effort, that desire to do right by this child, to show up for her, to be present even when presence was hard. "I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word," Margaret said. "You did what you thought you needed to do to save your daughter's life. And you were right. She is alive, and she is loved, and she has every chance to grow into a remarkable person. I don't forgive you because I don't think you did anything that needs forgiving. You made a choice that required more courage than most of us have. I respect that choice, and I'm grateful for it because it led Grace to me." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. She embraced Margaret, a gesture that might have felt impossible 6 months ago, but which now felt natural. Right? The culmination of a journey that had begun with a baby on a doorstep and had led to a completely transformed life. When Jennifer left, Margaret stood alone in the bakery for a moment, looking around at the space that had been her entire world for so many years. It looked the same as it always had. The shelves with their carefully arranged pastries, the ovens that had been the constant of her existence, the counter where she had stood and served hundreds of customers over the years. But it was completely different now, because Margaret herself was different. Her heart had opened to include another person, had expanded to include a community, had learned how to give and receive love in a way that she had somehow convinced herself was no longer possible. She went to the back room where Grace was sleeping in her crib, where she would sleep for a few more years before Margaret's life upstairs became the place where they lived together, where they would build a real home beyond just the bakery. Margaret looked at her daughter's sleeping face, at the way her small mouth was slightly open, at the impossibly long eyelashes that lay against her cheeks. Grace was breathing deeply, her hands curled into small fists, her tiny body completely relaxed in the trust of sleep. And Margaret felt the weight of gratitude so profound that it almost took her breath away. Gratitude for this moment, for this child, for the transformation that had taken place in her own heart. This baby, this unexpected Grace that had appeared on her doorstep, had given Margaret back her life. Not her old life, not the solitary existence that she had convinced herself was enough, but something better, something richer, something infinitely more real. Margaret understood now what it meant to matter to another person, what it meant to be needed in the most fundamental way, what it meant to love someone more than you loved your own carefully constructed sense of control. She understood what it meant to be part of something larger than herself, to have her existence validated not just by the work she did, but by the people she cared for, by the relationships she had been brave enough to open herself to after so many years of carefully locked doors. She leaned down and kissed the top of Grace's head, breathing in the baby smell that was already beginning to fade as Grace grew and changed and became more herself each day. Tomorrow Margaret would wake up at 4 in the morning and begin her baking, and Grace would eventually wake hungry and needing to be changed and wanting to be held. Jennifer would arrive in the afternoon to spend time with her daughter. Seamus would come in for his coffee and his roll. Catherine would stop by with some new books for Grace. Douglas would drop off another piece of furniture or a new toy. The community would continue to gather, to support, to be present, to remind Margaret that she was no longer alone, that she had never needed to be alone, that the greatest grace was the grace of connection. Margaret turned off the lights, leaving only the small nightlight that cast a gentle glow through the bakery. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, to the life that was waiting for her, to the sleep that would carry her toward tomorrow, and all the tomorrows beyond that. Tomorrows that would be filled with the presence of another person, with the responsibility and the joy and the overwhelming privilege of loving and being loved, of mattering, of belonging, of finally understanding what it meant to truly come home.